If you look historically at what happens with social change movements in the United States, they do become politically co-opted, and usually they become co-opted by the Democratic Party because the Republican Party has historically been the pro-business party. Democratic administrations tend to run on agendas of change. But once these politicians are elected to office, they tend to be, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, responsive to the interests that got them there, whether they're Barack Obama or Democratic or Republican legislators. So I think there's a very strong and easily explained tendency in the American governmental system for the Democratic Party in particular to be the big co-opter.
Well, basically we have, the U.S. ruling class has a wonderful ideal system for itself. They have two corporate parties. One is the Republican Party that is most brazen about defending corporate interests. The other one is the Democratic Party, which has the same corporate backers, or oftentimes the same corporate backers, and sometimes different corporate backers than the Republicans. But when Plan A isn't working out, they just usher in Plan B. So, in terms of social movements, what this means is that the Democrats have managed to absorb social movements historically. They're the lesser of two evils. I mean, that's the basis on which they function as, they're slightly better than the other corporate party.
The fact is that the lesser of the so-called, so-called lesser of the evil is still evil. That's like saying, would you like to die by hanging or by execution? Our response should be, I choose not to die at all. The word liberal, as far as I'm concerned, is like Brother Malcolm said, you had your foxes and your wolves. And the liberals are the foxes. And in this case, the so-called conservatives or the Republicans are the wolves. But they both want to devour you. They both want to devour you, to eat you, to disenfranchise you. That's what it's all about.
So beginning with the populists in the 1890s, which was began as a multiracial movement in the 1890s, became absorbed into the Democratic Party, which was a segregationist party. So it destroyed the populist movement. In the 1930s, the union movement became completely absorbed into the Democratic Party. And what that meant is that, great, when Roosevelt wants to grant reforms, it helps workers. When Roosevelt decides to turn on the working class, it hurts the workers' movement and leaves the workers' movement politically powerless to fight back against it because they're loyal to Roosevelt. So that's historically the role that the Democratic Party has played, and unfortunately continues to play at this point.
Well, the Obama phenomenon represents an incredible desire among the majority of people in the United States, and really worldwide, because Obama inspired governments and peoples all over the world. So it represents the pent-up frustrations with the last 30, 40 years, with the neoliberal counter-revolution and the deep-seated sentiment and desire for change, for fundamental change, social, economic, political, cultural change. And so there was a groundswell in support of Obama representing those sentiments and those desires for change. And ruling groups, the bigwigs within the Democratic Party, on Wall Street and the big financial institutions and transnational corporations, the wealthy, said, whoa, we can't deal with a groundswell from below. We need to we need to control the groundswell from below.
Tonight, an extraordinary conversation with three foreign policy giants. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, and former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. I interviewed them in New York yesterday evening at an event organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The conversation took place at the Rainbow Room, high above Rockefeller Center, here in New York.
The political awakening that is happening worldwide is a major challenge for America, because it means that the world is much more restless, it's stirring, it has aspirations which are not easily satisfied. And if America is to lead, it has to relate itself somehow to these new, lively, intense political aspirations which make our age so different from even the recent past.
But he can give a new impetus to American foreign policy, partly because the reception of him is so extraordinary around the world. I think his task will be to develop an overall strategy for America in this period when really a new world order can be created. It's a great opportunity. It isn't just a crisis.
And there he is, President-elect Barack Obama.
It's the answer told by lines that stretched around schools and churches in numbers this nation has never seen, by people who waited 3 hours and 4 hours, many for the first time in their lives, because they believed that this time must be different, that their voices could be that difference. I will promise you this, that if we have not gotten our troops out by the time I am president, it is the first thing I will do. I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war. You can take that to the bank. When I promise that we are going to bring this war in Iraq to a close in 2009, I want the American people to understand that I opposed this war in 2002, 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So you can have confidence that I will be serious about ending this war. Iran, they spend 1/100th of what we spend on the military. Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, these countries are tiny compared to the Soviet Union. They don't pose a serious threat to us.
I think it's time for us to end the embargo on Cuba. And I think that we have to end it because if you think about what's happening internationally, our planet is shrinking. And our biggest foreign policy challenge, and it feeds directly into the battle on terrorism, and it feeds into issues of trade and our economy, is how do we make sure that other countries in developing nations are providing sustenance for their people, human rights for their people, a basic structure of government for their people that is stable and secure so that they can be partners in a brighter future for the entire planet.
Close down Guantanamo, restore habeas corpus, say no to renditions, no to wireless wiretaps.
I have said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that. I've said repeatedly that America doesn't torture, and I'm going to make sure that we don't torture. Those are part and parcel of an effort to regain America's moral stature in the world.
And as president, I'm going to make it impossible for congressmen or lobbyists to slip pork barrel projects or corporate welfare into laws when no one's looking, because when I'm president, meetings where laws are written will be more open to the public, no more secrecy. That's a commitment I make to you as president. When there's a tax bill being debated in Congress, you will know the names of the corporations that would benefit and how much money they would get. And we will put every corporate tax break and every pork barrel project online for every American to see. You will know who asked for them, and you can decide whether your representative is actually representing you. Jobs that only solar panels and wind turbines and the fuel-efficient cars of tomorrow. Jobs that will help us end our dependence on foreign oil and save the planet.
process. Rebuilding our crumbling roads and schools and bridges, laying broadband in rural communities for everybody, so the businesses can walk into those rural communities. Setting up a new electricity grid so we can get renewable energy to population centers here in Indiana and across America. Build American infrastructure for the 21st century. Tired, worn-out old theory that says we should give more to billionaires and big corporations and hope that prosperity trickles down on everybody else. The last thing we can afford is 4 more years where no one in Washington is watching anyone on Wall Street because politicians and lobbyists killed common sense regulations. Those are the theories that got us into this mess. They haven't worked, and it is time for change, and that's why I'm running for President of the United States of America. Bail out Wall Street banks. As president, I will ensure the financial rescue plan helps stop foreclosures and protects your money instead of enriching CEOs. And I'll put in place the common sense regulations that I've been calling for throughout this campaign so that Wall Street can never cause a crisis like this again. That's the change we need. It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America. It is absolutely true that NAFTA was a mistake.
A senior member of the Obama campaign called the Canadian government within the last month to say that when Senator Obama talks about opting out of the free trade deal, the Canadian government shouldn't worry. The operative said it's just campaign rhetoric and don't take it seriously.
Campaign officials called the U.S. ambassador to Canada and say, don't worry, it's just campaign rhetoric about NAFTA.
The Canadian government put out a statement indicating that this was just not true. So I don't know who the sources. It wasn't true.
Amid all of the denials, sources at the highest level of the Canadian government who first confirmed that a call was made, late this afternoon, reconfirmed that a call was made.
How in the world are we going to speak about democracy when a tiny portion of society controls the financial and the material resources of society? How can you have a democratic system? For instance, the United States is the best example. If 1 or 2 or 3% of the population has the vast majority of wealth in society, how can you have a democracy? Because economic power is translated into political influence. That's been a lesson throughout history. So in the United States, the mechanism is that the wealthy and the powerful are able to finance electoral campaigns. If you want to be a viable candidate in any major election in the United States, you need vast resources. You need millions and millions of dollars. The last elections, how many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by each candidate in the last presidential elections. And unless you're independently wealthy, like Ross Perot, and you have your own hundreds of millions of dollars to invest, you need to turn to those in society that can supply these resources. You need to turn to the wealthy and the powerful. And that means that you subordinate your program to the needs of the wealthy and the powerful. That's the particular mechanism in the United States. But wherever we look in the world, we see that economic power translates into political influence.
In order to have a proper appreciation of the American economic system, we must know how the national income is divided in America. In other words, we must examine the distribution of the great wealth produced through the operation of American capitalism.
Each person represents 1% of American households. Each dollar represents 1% of America's privately owned wealth. The top 10% of American households own 72% of the wealth. The bottom 90% only owns 28% of the wealth. If we just look at the top 1%, They own 37% of the wealth. The top 1% owns more than the bottom 90%. The top 1% owns more than the bottom 90%.
The plutocracy, those very wealthy people, those one, it's about 0.04, one fraction of 1%. It's less than 1%. When you hear, oh, the top 1% owns 40%, it's less than 1%. It's about 145,000 individuals. They make up this super rich class. You know, Gore Vidal was telling us that when Ronald Reagan went rushing over to the Bohemian Grove and said, I want to crack at the presidency now. I'm governor of California, it's my time. They said, no, Ronnie, you got to wait. 1972, that's going to be tricky, Dick. Richard Nixon, he stepped back. He wasn't going to take on the power of the wealth. He's serving that power.
Mr. Reagan is for freedom, and he is for the people.
When people talk about the rich in this country, they really don't seem to have any idea how rich the rich really are. The very top is that fraction I just said of 1%. That's where it goes off the charts. The analogy is that if we could represent our income and wealth by playing blocks, children's playing blocks, each block represents $1,000. Most of us would have a pile that would go up maybe anywhere from 6 to 10 or 15 feet at most. But for that top super rich, this is Heilbronner's analogy, the piles of blocks would go up many times over the Eiffel Tower, many times higher than the Eiffel Tower. It would go out of sight.
Concentrations of wealth and power are fundamentally anti-democratic. That whenever you've got a monarchy or a giant corporation like the East India Company, you have a force within society that's going to dominate and dictate and control.
The company became so successful that it stopped being simply a trading empire and became a political one. At its peak, it even had its own army of around 200,000 men. By the early 19th century, it controlled much of India, making laws and raising taxes.
Today, we live in a society that is probably more economically stratified than any other country in the world. Literally, 2 or 3% of wealthy Americans own and control probably 80% or more of everything worth owning in our country. And we've seen how these pro-corporate political policies over the last 20 years are really coming home to roost. The middle class has been decimated, and the super rich have done quite well. In fact, only the super rich have really done quite well. Fundamentally, I think the problem here is that we have this system in the United States of politics that is beholden to private money. And even a candidate like Barack Obama, who campaigned as a change agent and actually did get a record number of contributions from small, average Americans, managed at the same time to get a record amount in contributions from the biggest interests out there, the insurance industry and Wall Street in particular. And when your political system depends on who can pour the most money into essentially TV propaganda, TV ads, and that's really the biggest determinant in the race. Can you hire the best marketers and PR people and advertisers, and can you raise enough money to really run a campaign that's going to overwhelm the airwaves? If you can do that, your odds of winning are probably about 4 or 5 to 1.
As to him being a phenomenon, The only phenomenon that Obama was the creation and manipulation of the media. He was a brand, the Obama brand. He was a creation and continues to be a creation / manipulation of the corporate media. Let us be honest about that. Hope, how dare that word be used and distorted the way the Obama brand has used it and distorted it.
The advertising industry gives a prize every year for the best marketing campaign of the year. 2008, they gave it to the Obama campaign, who beat out commercial competitors. The idea is we market candidates the same way we market toothpaste or lifestyle drugs or automobiles. Of course, it helps to have a lot of money. And in fact, Obama greatly outspent McCain, and not because of popular contributions. It came mostly from financial industries. He was their candidate. And his policies will presumably respond to his constituency.
Get back. I'm alright, Jack. Keep your hands off of my stack. Money, it's a hit. Don't get me back to good bullshit. I'm in the high fidelity first class traveling section. I think I need a lift jet.
President George Bush pushed for a multi-billion-dollar Wall Street bailout plan in an historic meeting attended by the two men fighting to succeed him. In a joint statement from the McCain and Obama campaigns, they both agreed that the Bush administration proposal is flawed, but would work together to find a solution.
Democrats and Republicans in Congress have legitimate concerns about it. I know many Americans share these concerns. It is clear, though, that this is what we have to do right now to prevent a crisis from turning into a catastrophe.
If the financial rescue bill fails in Congress yet again, the present crisis will turn into a disaster.
There's no need whatsoever for the bailout. They should and it's not a bailout, it's a giveaway, and it's a giveaway that'll create a new kleptocracy of billionaires. Of course you have to protect people's savings in the banks. Of course you even have to protect the money market funds, but you don't have to protect all of this money at the very top of the pyramid, because all this money that is being protected are other people's debts.
But this is weapons of mass destruction in Iraq all over again.
Yes. panic the people, make them think there's an emergency. There's no emergency at all. This is a once-in-a-century ripoff. And you can only do this kind of thing under emergency conditions, usually with the kind of bloodshed you saw when Pinochet introduced free markets at gunpoint in Chile.
And by the federal government, I mean Republicans and Democrats working together. And the only thing dumber than a Republican or a Democrat is when these pricks work together. We have a two-party system. The Democratic Party, which is a party of no ideas, and the Republican Party, which is a party of bad ideas. And the way it works is the Republican stands up in Congress and goes, "I got a really bad idea." And the Democrat says, "And I can make it shittier."
This bill does not deal with the absurdity of having the fox guarding the henhouse. I have a hard time understanding why we are giving $700 billion to the Secretary of the Treasury, who was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who, along with other financial institutions, actually got us into this problem.
If there's so much money available, how come it's not being spent to create jobs for millions of jobless people? And why do we continue hearing that the country's in a recovery?
Yeah, it's really crazy. You know, I mean, if you took the $1.4 trillion that were initially spent just to bail out the banks, and you had redistributed that money among all the millions of Americans who were having problems paying their mortgages and who had just lost their jobs in the previous year or two, I remember doing the math and back of the envelope determining that each one would receive a check for $350,000. The reason is because the U.S. government does not serve the people, and it's not afraid of the people, and even though it knows that its actions are short-sighted and will ultimately lead to its demise, they cannot help themselves. They cannot stop themselves.
To manage wealth requires keen insight, the heart and focus of the hunter, and the understanding that wealth is not about money, but the possibilities it creates. Just as volatility may produce turbulence, there may also be dazzling moments when lightning strikes. Introducing Goldman Sachs Wealth Management.
Who got us into the financial crisis? People like, for example, Robert Rubin, the Secretary of Treasury under Clinton. His great achievement, one of his great achievements, was to destroy the New Deal legislation. It's called the Glass-Steagall Act, which protected commercial banks from risky lending. So it ensured that commercial banks would have enough liquidity, you know, and they would be regulated, and therefore you'd be pretty safe when you put your money in a bank. Investment firms, on the other hand, take out risky loans, try to make very high profit. If they get into trouble, they expect the government to come in and bail them out, and so on. The Glass-Steagall Act separated those. Rubin led the way to revoking the Glass-Steagall Act. As soon as he did so, he left the government, became a director of Citigroup, a major financial institution, and used the new powers to enable Citigroup to control insurance companies and investment firms and so on, and made plenty of profit from that for a few years until, of course, the whole system collapsed. And Citigroup is now getting tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money to keep them alive. Okay, that's Robert Rubin. He was succeeded as Treasury Secretary by Lawrence Summers.
And as one of the great economic minds of our time, Larry has earned a global reputation for being able to cut to the heart of the most complex and novel policy challenges. With respect to both our current financial crisis and other pressing economic issues of our time, his thinking, writing, and speaking have set the terms of the debate.
Summers, one of his main achievements was to block legislation that would regulate exotic financial instruments, credit swaps, and so on. The religion under which they operate is what's called the efficient market hypothesis. Everything will take care of itself if you just leave markets alone. They're just magic. No empirical basis, no theoretical basis, but it's a good tool for wealth of the nation. They can make a lot of money out of it. So Summers blocked that legislation. And another factor in the current disastrous financial crisis is the fact that these exotic instruments exploded out of control. And nobody knows who owns what assets are worth. So again, the government has to step in and bail out the wealthy. Government, of course, means the taxpayer.
Where did Geithner work?
Geithner has been a failure at pretty much everything he's done in life. Most of the institutions that destroyed the economy were under his direct regulatory authority.
How did he get the job as Treasury Secretary?
By completely screwing up his job as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That makes no sense.
Of course it makes perfect sense. This is not new to Washington. People who will give you the wrong answer, but the answer you want, are invaluable, and they often get promoted precisely because they're willing to say and do absurd things.
Tim Geithner offers not just extensive experience shaping economic policy and managing financial markets, he also has an unparalleled understanding of our current economic crisis in all of its depth, complexity, and urgency. Tim will waste no time getting up to speed. He will start his first day on the job with a unique insight into the failures of today's markets and a clear vision of the steps we must take to revive them.
First of all, let's look at the people who deregulated the industry. They're the same people that are in Obama's White House. Larry Summers is chief economic advisor. Gary Gensler, the head of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. I mean, it's the same people that deregulated that are now being asked to re-regulate. I mean, only somebody that's completely out of their minds would believe this.
President Obama today nominated Ben Bernanke for a second four-year term as Federal Reserve Chairman. The president called his actions on the global financial crisis bold and out of the box.
As an expert on the causes of the Great Depression, I'm sure Ben never imagined that he would be part of a team responsible for preventing another.
Wall Street's wealthy and powerful are back to indulging. Pampering at the La Prairie Spa at the Ritz-Carlton involves wearing decadent hors d'oeuvres, cream costing more than $700 for less than 4 ounces, while the caviar facial costs more than $300.
Ruins turning hundreds of homes into shattered garbage. Just 2 hours away from Manhattan, a city plagued with decay. This is Camden, the most broke town in the U.S., with up to 35% of families living in poverty.
A $175 hamburger served up at the Wall Street Burger Shop. 10 ounces of Kobe beef, seared foie gras, aged Gruyere cheese, and...
This is kind of where all the value lies. This is a white truffle as well as a black truffle.
As well as gold, as in gold leaf flakes, to garnish off the burger.
Doesn't taste like anything. It's really just to make it pretty.
There's families that's out here on the streets, a mom and her kids sleeping on the Lower Wacker Drive, cold as it's being, sleeping on the Lower Wacker Drive. When mom goes to sleep, the little kids are up watching over her, and that's sad.
Busyness boosted perhaps by bonuses coming from one street, Wall Street, the symbol of the finance industry, the financial collapse, and record-breaking compensation. $144 billion apparently, up 4% from last year's record haul.
Goldman Sachs has set aside $6.8 billion for bonuses.
Case in point, General Electric, the corporate giant, received nearly $25 million in stimulus grants. In return, 18,000 U.S.-based employees were laid off. No such promises here on Main Street, where 15 million Americans are officially unemployed, and U.S. poverty levels have reached a 50-year high.
Well, he knows what he wants, don't you, Rocco?
Sure. What's that?
Tell him, Rocco. Well, I want, he wants more, don't you, Rocco?
Yeah, that's it. More. That's right, I want more. Will you ever get enough?
Will you, Rocco?
Well, I never have. No, I guess I won't. Do you know what you want?
Yes, and I had hopes once, but I gave them up.
Hopes for what?
A world in which there's no place for Johnny Rocco.
Mr. President, Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Mr. President, there is a war going on in this country, and I'm not referring to the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. I'm talking about a war being waged by some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in this country against the working families of the United States of America, against the disappearing and shrinking middle class of our country. The reality is that many of the nation's billionaires are on the warpath. They want more, more, more. Their greed has no end. And apparently there is very little concern for our country or for the people of this country if it gets in the way of the accumulation of more and more wealth and more power. Between 1980 and 2005, 80% of all new income created in this country went to the top 1%. 80% of all new income. And that's why people are wondering and asking, what's going on in my life? How come I'm working longer hours for lower wages? How come I'm worrying about whether my kids will have as good a standard of living as I've had?
So we keep producing more and more for the employer, productivity rises, but the employer doesn't give us any more at all. You do not need an advanced degree in economics, and being a professor of economics, I wouldn't advise it anyway. But you don't need it to understand that if workers are producing more and more for the employer, but he's not giving them more and more, then the whole benefit of rising productivity accrues to profits. So the people who made out like bandits in the last 30 years were the employers, number one, and whoever could get a piece of the profits the employers were getting. We call those people stock owners, shareholders. People who have a piece of a company can get a piece of the profits the company earns. That's how our system works. They did wonderfully. The quintessential story comes to this apex. I've been telling you how Americans went on a borrowing binge. Have any of you wondered, where did the money come to lend all those Americans all that money? Who's the lender? What's the source of the money? And if you understand what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand in a nutshell the remarkable quality of our society over the last 30 years. Because the origin of the money lent to the American worker were the extraordinary profits of American business. They had made so much money because the productivity went up when the wages went down that they turned around and used the extra profits that they got by not paying higher wages to lend it to the workers instead. Think of yourself now, and some of you will enjoy this, as if you were a businessman or a businesswoman, an employer. This is as close to nirvana as business gets. Instead of paying your workers higher wages over time as they work harder and better for you, you don't. Instead of that, we give them a loan, which they have to give back to us with interest. If I had a portable record machine now, I'd play the national anthem.
The United States now has, by far, the most unequal distribution of income and wealth of any major country on earth. When we were in school, we used to read the textbooks which talked about the banana republics in Latin America.
I'm Chiquita Banana, and I've come to say bananas have to ripen in a certain way, and when they're flecked with brown and have a golden hue, bananas taste the best and are the best for you.
We used to read the books about countries in which a handful of people owned and controlled most of the wealth of those countries. Well, guess what? That's exactly what is happening in the United States today. So I am sure that in a little while, my friends are going to come down to the floor and say, we're very concerned about the deficit. We're very concerned about the national debt. But you know what we're more concerned about? Giving huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country. But, Mr. President, the tax issue is just one part of what some of our wealthy friends want to see happen in this country. The reality is that many of these folks want to bring the United States back to where we were in the 1920s. And they want to do their best to eliminate all traces of social legislation which working families fought tooth and nail to develop to bring a modicum of stability and security to their lives. There are people out there, not all, but there are some who want to privatize or completely eliminate Social Security. They want to privatize or cut back substantially on Medicare. Yeah, if you're 75 years of age and you have no money, good luck to you getting your health insurance at an affordable cost from a private insurance company. I am just sure there are all kinds of private insurance companies out there just delighted to take care of low-income seniors who are struggling with cancer or another disease. Mr. President, furthermore, there are corporate leaders out there and many members of Congress who not only want to continue, they want to expand our disastrous trade policies. My wife and I went shopping the other day, started our Christmas shopping. And we looked, and virtually every product that was out there in the store, consumer products, was China, China, and China. We seem to be a country in which we have a 51st state named China, which is producing virtually all of the products that we as Americans consume.
响叮当，我们滑雪多快乐，我们坐在雪橇上。叮叮当，叮叮当，铃儿响叮当，我们滑雪多快乐，我们坐在雪橇上。叮叮当，叮叮当，铃儿响叮当，我们滑雪多快乐，我们坐在雪橇上。叮叮当，叮叮当，铃儿响叮当。滑雪多快乐，我们坐在雪橇上，冲破大风雪，我们坐在雪橇上，直过田野，欢笑又歌唱，人声响叮当，你的精神多欢畅，今晚滑雪真快乐，把滑雪歌儿唱。
Our trade policy has resulted in the loss of millions of good-paying jobs as large corporations and CEOs have said, why do I want to reinvest in America when I can go to countries where people are paid 50 cents, 75 cents an hour? That's what I'm going to do, to heck with the working people of this country.
Workers in other parts of the world were cheaper. Modern telecommunications made it possible to coordinate with your managers all over the world as quickly as it used to be to walk down the hall and talk to your manager at the end of the corridor. And so America moved production out of the United States, massively. A little statistic again, because economists are expected to throw statistics. I don't want to do too much, but a little, just so you remember that I am an economist. 60% of the goods coming into the United States from China are produced by subsidiaries of American corporations. There's a great temptation in this country to talk about the Chinese, Yes, it's Chinese workers who make them, but 60% of what comes in here is produced by American subsidiaries, American companies that are employing Chinese workers in China because they're a hell of a lot cheaper than American workers here.
So not only are we saddled with this disastrous trade policy, there are people who actually want to expand it. Now, one of the things that we're going to see going on is that while we struggle with a record-breaking deficit and a large national debt caused by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, caused by tax breaks for the wealthy, caused by an unpaid-for Medicare Part D prescription drug program, caused by the Wall Street bailout, driving up the deficit, driving up the national debt. Then some people can say, oh, my goodness, we got all of those expenses, and then we got to give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires, but we want to balance the budget. Gee, how are we going to do that? Well, obviously, we know how they're going to do that. We're going to cut back on health care. We're going to cut back on education. We're going to cut back on child care. We're going to cut back on Pell programs. We just don't have enough money for working families and their needs. We're going to cut back on food stamps. We're surely not going to expand unemployment compensation. We got a higher priority, Mr. President. We have got to give tax breaks to billionaires. I mean, that's what this whole place is about, isn't it? They fund the campaigns. They get what's due them.
I'm Jason Calabrese with the Financial News, and today we're talking to a real Irishman and someone in the money business about what's going on in Ireland with the Celtic Tiger and the banks are hurting so much, the downfall. What's the story here?
Do you really want to know?
I'd love to know.
Well, I'll tell you, it's like what has happened all over the Western world for the last 20 or 30 years. Greed, and more fucking greed and cheap money. And in Ireland, it's a tragedy what happened to the Tiger. We have, I'd say, 4 causes. We had a stupid fucking government. We had a regulator that was asleep at the wheel. We had very deceitful and conniving and corrupt developers. And of course, above all, wanking fucking bankers. Wanking bankers. We had these arseholes that for the last 20, 30 years are getting these massive bonuses, these employees and directors of banks, on the misfortune of the working class and getting these huge bonuses and salaries. But, you know, if you and all these arseholes should be thrown in jail and the keys thrown away for the rest of their life. And you know, sir, if you went in and you're unemployed and you wanted to take a loaf of bread out of a store or a supermarket to feed your family, guess what? You'll be up in court for it. These assholes are living all over the world now on the backs of the misfortunate working people. And who's going to pay for all this? We've mortgaged the next generation or two. Who's going to pay for it? The working man. We got the labourer, the small farmer, the fisherman, the nurse, the teacher, the policeman, the fireman, the plumber, the carpenter. Fuck's sake, man, this is a joke.
So I'm sensing a wee bit of discontent?
You are indeed, sir. And by the way, let's not be too cocky in this part of the world, North America either. All these debts that people have accumulated over the last 30 years, hey, everybody gets their day in the sunshine.
And you know, speaking of the Celtic Tiger and all that you mentioned, you know that Michael Flatley is really from Chicago. Well, that's another story.
Fuck off!
Well, yeah, I mean, the notion of my giving advice to elites in the United States is kind of comical because I don't see why they should listen to me. They listen to themselves. They don't listen to people like me. But the first advice I would give to elites in the United States, assuming they would pay any attention, it was on a sign that I saw in the New York Times of demonstrators down at Wall Street in October of 2008, after the crash. There were demonstrators down there, and they're carrying a huge sign, and the sign said, "Jump, fuckers." Now, that's the advice I would give them. The first advice is, jump from the highest place you can find.
The world is my
the end of history. It's caged and frozen still. There is no other pill to take. So swallow the one that made you ill. Maria, Rosita, La Santa Maria, the Luce, the rapist, the fields overseer, the agents of orange, the priest of Hiroshima, the cause of my desire to sleep now in the fire.
Is it the war on dissent, or rather, the war on terrorism? Well, that's what many folks are asking, especially after the FBI raided the homes of several anti-war activists and leaders in Minneapolis, Chicago, and possibly other cities in the Midwest. Now, members of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force apparently seized personal photos, computers, and cell phones, also serving federal grand jury subpoenas on several activists.
Well, the anti-war protesters themselves have said that this is an attempt to intimidate them so that they cease organizing anti-war demonstrations. I think it's much more serious even than that. And what the United States government is doing is establishing in the public's mind that anyone who criticizes the so-called war on terror is giving material aid to terrorism. You see, we don't have a war against Iraq or war against Afghanistan. We have a war against terror. And under the rubric of terror, the government has stripped us of our civil liberties. And so what they're doing now is to create the impression and get public acceptance of the idea that people who protest the war against terror are aligned with terrorists. And the definition of material support is one of those very vague police state terms that can be interpreted however the government wants.
Well, President Obama signed the controversial $858 billion tax cut legislation into law Friday. At least a quarter of the tax savings under the deal will go to the wealthiest 1% of the population. The only group that'll see its taxes increase are the nation's lowest paid workers. The only group that'll see its taxes increase are the nation's lowest paid workers. The only group that'll see its taxes increase are the nation's lowest paid workers. At the same time that this tax bill was passed, which will increase taxes on the working poor and decrease, of course, at the highest level, the wealthiest Americans, link the war with spending on the war with what we're spending on people at home and dealing with poverty here.
Well, you know, this became a very prominent theme that Martin Luther King beat home, especially in the last years of his life during the Vietnam War, that especially because we're going into debt. I mean, we're building a kind of debt peonage system, which is used then as an excuse to go after wage earners, to go after systems like Social Security. I mean, one of the most pernicious things that Obama did in this tax bill was reduce contributions to Social Security, because, of course, that's next on the target, as well as raise the deficit by $700 and $900 billion. And what's terrifying about movements like the Tea Party is that they provide a kind of emotional consistency, and of course that undercurrent of racism towards undocumented workers, towards Muslims, is very much part of the language of that pernicious right wing, but it embraces all things military, as if somehow the military is not part of government. It's an irrational political policy. You know, they want to get government off their backs, but everybody wants to extend unemployment benefits, Social Security, Medicare, and of course not touch the big the force that is draining hollowing the country out from the inside, which is the military-industrial complex, 50% of all discretionary spending. And so as these deficits, we've now racked up the largest deficits in human history, and as these deficits are ratcheted upwards, and there is an inability to question the self-destructive quality of the armament industry, then it's taken out on the backs of the working class. Our working class is already in tremendous financial straits, and the middle class.
The incoming House Banking Committee Chair, Spencer Baucus, said in Washington the view is that the banks are to be regulated. My view is that Washington and the regulators are there to serve the banks.
Well, that's pretty much been the policy since Bill Clinton.
Your assessment of President Obama?
A disaster, a poster child for the bankruptcy of the liberal class. Somebody who, like Clinton, is a self-identified liberal, who speaks in the traditional language of liberalism, but has made war against the core values of liberalism, which is a concern for those people outside the narrow power elite. The tragedy, if tragedy is the right word, is that Obama, who made this Faustian bargain with corporate interests in order to gain power, has now been crumpled up and thrown away by these interests. They don't need him anymore. He functioned as a brand after the disastrous 8 years of George Bush. And what we are watching is an even more craven attempt on the part of the White House to cater to the forces that are literally destroying the United States, are reconfiguring this country into a form of neo-feudalism.
54% of U.S. federal tax dollars go into the military. 19% is just paying off the interest on old wars that are over and we're not fighting anymore. So what the United States is all about is about invading other countries and exerting foreign military power, whether it's through military bases, of which nobody even knows how many there are. If you call the Pentagon, they can't tell you if it's 700, 800, 900, or 1,000 bases. They don't know how many people they have under arms. Somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million, directly or indirectly, using mercenaries. I mean, it's a crazy, monolithic, Roman-style empire.
In his book, Dreams from My Father, Obama refers to the job he took after he graduated from Columbia in 1983. He describes his employer as, and I quote, a consulting house to multinational corporations, unquote. For some reason, he doesn't say who his employer was or what he did there. The employer was Business International Corporation, which has a long history of providing cover for the CIA with covert action and infiltrating unions on the left. I know this because it was especially active in my own country, Australia. Obama doesn't say what he did at Business International, and there may be absolutely nothing sinister, but it seems worthy of inquiry and debate as a clue to perhaps who the man is.
Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much. This is a very loud welcome from a group that's supposed to be silent warriors. Mr. President, it is a great honor and pleasure to welcome you to the CIA.
Here is the 45th President of the United States having stacked his government with warmongers and corporate fraudsters and polluters from the Bush and Clinton eras, promising not only more of the same, but a whole new war in Pakistan, justified by the murderous cliches of Hillary Clinton, cliches like high-value targets. Within 3 days of his inauguration, Obama was ordering the death of people in faraway countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan. The clever young man who recently made it to the White House is a very fine hypnotist. In the middle of a recession, with millions of Americans losing their jobs and homes, Obama has increased the military budget. In Colombia, he is planning to spend $46 million on a new military base that will support a regime backed by death squads and further the tragic history of Washington's intervention in that region. In a pseudo event in Prague, Obama promised a world without nuclear weapons.
The existence of thousands of nuclear weapons is the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War.
To a global audience mostly unaware that America is building new tactical nuclear weapons designed to blur the distinction between nuclear and conventional war. But I think the real tragedy is that Obama the brand appears to have crippled or absorbed much of the anti-war movement, the peace movement. The Out of Iraq caucus is out of action. Its members can't even come up with a form of words of why they are silent. On March the 21st, a demonstration at the Pentagon by the once mighty United for Peace and Justice drew only a few thousand. The outgoing president of UPJ, Leslie Kagan, says her people aren't turning up because, and I quote, "It's enough for many of them that Obama has a plan to end the war and that things are moving in the right direction."
The Jonas brothers are here. They're out there somewhere. Sasha and Malia are huge fans, but boys don't get any ideas. I have two words for you: Predator drones. You will never see it coming.
Tears and anger after another airstrike left again innocent civilians dead. This time around, the attack took place in Garuch, a remote village in the Lagman province that was attacked by coalition forces for the fourth time in the past year. These people show us the clothes of those who died. "I lost everything," says this woman. "I lost my husband and my 2 sons. What have I done wrong? There is nothing left for me except these orphans." Days after the attack, the villagers are still collecting the body parts, and children cry, fearing that the bombs will come again. The people in the village say they are tired of the bombs and of seeing their children die. There is no Al-Qaeda here, no Taliban, they say. Shortly after the attack, demonstrations in Lagman called the Americans to leave their country. Human rights organizations say nearly 700 civilians were killed in operations by foreign and Afghan forces against the militants until October last year.
I've said that we need to increase the size of our military, which politically, if it got to the floor, probably would pass. But there, as you know, a whole bunch of folks on the left who think that that is a waste of money. I think it's important for us to do.
Today, President Obama scored a victory to keep those detainees locked up indefinitely, without even getting one chance to prove their innocence in court.
We also learned the Obama administration will continue the Bush policy of extraordinary rendition, the practice of sending terror suspects to prisons in third-party countries for interrogation.
The cell was about 3 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and about 7 feet high. It was my home for 10 months and 10 days. Whenever I heard the guards coming to open my door, I would just, think this is it for me. That would be my last day. And it was so painful to the point that I forgot every moment I enjoyed in my life.
The real picture of Omar Khadr, which has been revealed in the last few months as the contents of U.S. government documents have been disclosed for the first time, is that of a frightened, wounded, 15-year-old boy. A boy, like other children wrongfully involved in armed conflict, who had no business being there, who sat slumped against a bush while a battle raged around him. Omar was then shot in the back, at least twice, by a U.S. soldier, and was then about to be executed when another soldier intervened.
Americans
time off the American?
Everything is miraculous. There's no names. I'm just saying that because I'm approaching me very bad in my brain. So I have to say what I said.
Don't care about me, that's well, I do care about you, but I...
Chiquita is the world's most well-known banana brand. Colombia is one of the world's largest banana exporting nations in what is a multinational, multi-billion-dollar industry. So with so much money at stake, it's perhaps no surprise that Chiquita became embroiled in the crossfire from Colombia's bloody civil war. Between 1997 and 2004, Chiquita gave $1.7 million to paramilitaries from the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, known as the AUC, for what Chiquita later characterized as self-defense. But the AUC death squads killed thousands of civilians, as well as intimidating and murdering banana workers and their union leaders.
Well, first of all, look at the controversies that
Democrats and progressives were so vocal about during the Bush years. They objected vehemently over the Bush administration's wiretapping of American citizens without any court warrants or judicial oversight. They objected when the Bush administration put not American citizens but foreign nationals into cages at Guantanamo merely on the say-so of the president that these people were terrorists. Here you're talking about the worst elements of those policies, but even more extreme. You're talking about American citizens not being merely wiretapped by the president with no oversight, but murdered, assassinated, killed, based solely on the unchecked say-so of the president. And I think what really has to be emphasized is look at how many times over the past decade that the administration, first the Bush administration and the Obama administration, has accused people of being terrorists, the worst of the worst, and it turned out that they were completely wrong. Hundreds of people who were at Guantanamo ended up being released because there was no evidence of wrongdoing. Ever since the Supreme Court in 2008 granted habeas corpus rights to detainees, 33 out of 39 Guantanamo detainees who brought their cases before a court were ordered released by federal judges on the grounds that there was no evidence to justify the accusations against them. So there are few things more dangerous than allowing the executive branch to label people terrorists and treat them accordingly.
I have two words for you: predator drones. You will never see it coming.
On Capitol Hill, resistance to U.S. militarism has all but collapsed. With no opposition whatsoever in the Senate and only 48 nay votes in the House, the Congress last week passed the biggest military budget since the end of World War II. Only 42 Democrats, including just 12 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, dared to defy their warmongering president and compliant House leadership. Forget about Obama's phony rhetoric. The proof is in the numbers. The military budget firmly cements Barack Obama's place as the biggest pro-war president in 2 generations. Today, the United States, although it is the world's only superpower, spends almost as much as all of the rest of the world's militaries combined. The U.S. defense authorization for 2011 is $725 billion. China, with the second most expensive military machine on the planet, spends less than $80 billion a year. If Barack Obama lasts for 8 years in office, he is on track to spend $5 trillion on the Pentagon, significantly more than George Bush, who in turn spent a lot more than Ronald Reagan. But, as they say on the TV commercials, that's not all. The defense budget doesn't include expenditures for Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, nuclear weapons work at the Department of Energy, military aid to other countries through the Department of State, NASA space programs that are really military projects, and the interest payments on past military expenditures that were financed by debt. Inclusion of those hidden costs of war would bring military-related spending to well over $1 trillion a year and rising all the time. In real dollars, the U.S. is spending far more on the military than at any time during the Cold War, when there was another superpower in competition, and more than President Lyndon Johnson spent at the height of the Vietnam War. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. broke with LBJ over that war, in part because he knew, in Dr. King's words, that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. Obama is not merely a continuation of the Bush administration's war policies. He has accelerated the descent into a war economy.
The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. This way of settling differences is not just. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as one who loves America. To the leaders of our own nation, the great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours.
Is this what you meant when you wrote that every one of this country's primary institutions is anti-democratic, anti-democratic in spirit, design, and operation?
It is.
That's a strong statement. Every one of the country's primary institutions, meaning?
Meaning educational institutions, large-scale educational institutions, meaning institutions of government, bureaucratic institutions, major institutions of media and communication, major institutions of a recognizably economic kind as well, and I think large cultural institutions too. Again, something like the media.
Is anti-democratic, meaning?
Meaning that two things. One, hierarchical. They're all hierarchical structures, and hierarchy means inequality, means inequality of power. Secondly, I think they're fundamentally elitist in character, which is to say that each of them involves a definition of who should lead or control that institution based upon criteria which can only be met by a relatively few. So it becomes a way of excluding.
And that means anti-democratic. You do not consult the people. You do not involve the people.
The basic idea of liberal democracy is that the only economy that's consonant with liberal democracy is capitalism. And capitalism presupposes a class structure in which those who own and control the means of production own and control the means of production. And they have a lot more clout politically than those who don't. For me, that's a fundamentally undemocratic political economy. So for me, democratic capitalism is a contradiction in terms. For me, the only system of social relationships that's consonant with democracy is a high level of economic independence and economic equality. Because without economic independence, if I'm dependent for somebody else for what I have to have access to live, might be a nice guy, might employ me, but I'm weak relative to him. I'm powerless relative to him. And he's got the hammer on me. And I damn well better satisfy and please him, or I'm in trouble. And I'm in trouble at the level of necessity, okay, of living and dying. And certainly not living well, but maybe not living at all. So for me, socialist democracy or democratic socialism is in fact the only coherent mix of political democracy and social economic equality that adds up in my mind to something that looks like democracy. So I argue that capitalist democracy is in fact a sham. It's never going to be a real democracy because it can't. And the only real democracy, at least then theoretically, is a socialist democracy. What you immediately run into if you make that argument, how about Russia? What about Stalin? What about Pol Pot? I mean, what about they drag out all these horror stories of societies that have purportedly tried socialist democracy. And my answer to that, and my short answer to that, is there's very little in those societies that I would credit as in any way socialist or democratic. Okay. In the Soviet Union, it wasn't the people who owned and controlled the means of production, it was the state.
The continuous, consistent growth of centralized power in our society. People think of Ronald Reagan as an opponent of state power and as someone who wanted to get government off our backs.
I would like to take the lead in taking government off the backs of the American people and turning you loose to do what I know you can do.
But actually, one of the legacies of the Reagan era is a stronger state, a state that doesn't do as much in terms of regulation of the economy as the states growing out of the New Deal, Fair Deal kind of tradition, but a state which, in terms of defense, in terms of the protection of American interests abroad, in areas such as the advancement of technology or the law and order state, all of those involve extensions of national power.
Is this for better or worse?
I think it's for worse. I think it's for worse because it's been accompanied, as we know, by an incredible amount of apathy on the part of the American electorate in terms of the simple fact of voting. It is a less alert, a less involved electorate at the national level.
You say in your book that the story of the United States is drawing to a close, and you call the U.S. a zombie empire. And especially in the light of the recent elections, when we see Republicans again enjoying their power, it really feels like a circle. Republican, Democrats, Republicans, Democrats. Where will that change come from that you talk about?
Well, it's certainly not going to come within the existing system. What we're seeing now that you just referred to, this flip-flopping, the two parties are so close together on the overall ideological framework from left to right that there's not enough differentiation. So big swaths of the population don't feel represented at all, which is why our voter turnout is among the lowest in the industrialized world. The change is not going to come from the D's and the R's, the Democrats and the Republicans, and the fact that people are constantly just voting against the party in power is a symptom of that. People are frustrated. The message they're sending is not, right now, we support the Republicans, nor was it in 2008, we support the Democrats. The message is, we hate them both, so we're voting no. The story of the United States government as the 20th century invading, bullying, imperialistic, economic and political empire, that is coming to a close. It is unhealthy for us, and it's obviously terrible for the world.
The suspicion about elections is extrapolating from the environment in which we function, an environment in which elections are a joke, an environment in which, Sarah Palin's hairdresser earns more than McCain's foreign policy advisor. Why is that? Because it makes sense. All right? It's not because they're stupid, it's because her hair matters more than his foreign policy proposals. Why? Because the population knows the foreign policy proposals are lies. They know there's no reason to believe what anybody says about anything like that. On the other hand, her hair is truthful.
Alaska Governor Sarah Palin joins us from her living room in Wasilla, Alaska. What'd you do to your hair?
Do you like it? I tried to look like you.
Okay. Yes, I'm not used to you having that many curls. It's kind of cute, but it's a surprise just to see you pop up there with the curls. Great. What's the weather like in Wasilla today?
Thank you.
So the national government becomes stronger, but the participation, knowledge, and involvement of the people diminishes.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's becoming much more of a surveillance and control state in terms of the way that it intervenes in, knows about, pries into individual lives.
Growing out of what you just said, this will strike you as a very simplistic question, but I need to ask it. Do we have a democracy?
It isn't a simplistic question, and the answer is, I think we don't.
I'm voting because I have the right to vote.
It's a beautiful thing to be able to vote. Vote because for the first time ever, an African American can end up in the White House.
Vote because for the second time in history, a woman is running for vice president.
If you're not voting for yourself, vote for people like me.
Vote for the future of your children.
Voting for education, health care.
I'm voting for a better planet.
I'm voting because when I was growing up, my father told me that if you don't vote, then you have to shut up.
And every vote counts. That's why I vote.
I like Capono.
I don't think the idea of democracy and the idea of a strong state, centralized, inherently bureaucratic and administrative in its structure and orientation, that those are compatible notions. I think democracy does imply involvement, shared power, dispersed power, and above all, a significant equality. And I think state power means the opposite of those things. And similarly, I think the democracy clearly is at odds with corporate structures and the power of corporate structures.
Hierarchy.
Exactly. And also power that's unaccountable, power that basically is unresponsive and is concerned with other things, bottom lines, profit margins, and the rest.
Don't we, in fact, have a rather thinly concealed power structure of large public institutions and private corporations?
I think the most important developments in the last 25 years or so has been the closer integration and intertwining of those two dominant structures of power, economic and political power.
The definition of polyarchy that we have in the social sciences is a system where the participation of masses of people is limited to voting among one or another representatives of the elite in periodic elections. And in between elections, the masses are now expected to keep quiet, to go back to life as usual, while the elite make the decisions and run the world until they can choose between one or another elite another 4 years later. So really, polyarchy is a system of elite rule, and a system of elite rule which is a little more soft-core than the type of elite rule that we would see under a military dictatorship, for instance. But what we see is that under a polyarchy, the basic socioeconomic system does not change. It does not become democratized. Wealth is not redistributed downward. You don't see a more equitable redistribution of wealth and resources. So that's the key. Socioeconomic dictatorship and free elections.
I think an economic system that works in the ways I've just gone through with you, that ends up sending money to China, that leaves people unemployed, that leaves people losing their homes. You know, we are a wonderful country. We now have a record number of homeless people, side by side with a record number of unoccupied homes. We are a country in which we line up the homeless people to stare across the street at the empty homes. This is crazy. A system as unstable as this, as costly socially as this, is a system that this population ought to have the courage to question. The Cold War is 20 years behind us. 20 years ago, Americans were afraid to question capitalism because that might make you disloyal and be a proponent of communism or socialism. The socialism and communism of Russia is over, of Eastern Europe is gone, and the Chinese look more like us every day anyway. So maybe now we can have the courage to say, can't we do better? Can't we do better than this? Do we have to live with this? It's long past due that we face up to it and ask, if all of this happened because of decisions made by employers and employees over the organization of business and the paying of wages and the earning of profits, maybe we ought to organize business differently. Another way to say it. Americans like democracy. They like the idea that in the neighborhood where you live, in the town where you reside, you shouldn't have people telling you how to live, where to live, when to live. You should have the ability to vote for people, to vote them out of office if you're displeased with them. In other words, the people who are living with the results of the decisions of our community leaders should have power over them. I like that idea. I suppose most of you do. So here's a question. If that's a good idea in the community, how come it isn't a good idea at the workplace? How come? Why do we permit the workplace to be a place where you come, you do what you're told, how you're told, when you're told, where you're told, and when you're done, you go home and you leave behind what you've done, and your say over what's done with that is zero. You accept that. Why? If it isn't working well, if it produces 2 collapses in 75 years and 16 business downturns in between, and if it has half the qualities we've just gone through, what is your loyalty to that system? Wouldn't it be better to say that we ought to try democracy at the workplace?
The tragedy of American culture is that across the political and cultural spectrum, we are fed this mantra that if we dig deep enough within ourselves, if we focus on happiness, if we grasp that we are truly exceptional, if we find our inner strength, we can have everything we want. Reality is not an impediment to what we desire.
The American dream.
The American dream.
I've spent my whole life chasing the American dream.
And that's magical thinking. And it is rammed down our throats. Oprah does it every week.
Give you this veto, but how about if we give each person in your audience the brand new, totally redesigned 2012 Volkswagen Beetle?
Everybody does it. And that, in essence, has created a culture that is probably the most illusioned culture on the planet. And when you live in an illusion, you remain in a state of perpetual infantilism, childishness. You never grow up. And now that gap is opening between the illusion of who we think we are and where we're going, and the reality. I don't have any problem with going to vote. That's a process that at most takes 1 or 2 hours. That's all people do, and they think they've finished. Voting is such a minor part of beginning to reform and reshape our society. Look, I will not vote for Democrat. I was in there the last election voting for members of the Revolutionary Socialist Party. I didn't even know who they were. I don't care. I'm quite happy to muck up the system. But voting, and everybody should vote for the Green candidate, great. But stop thinking that the route to reform is electoral politics. And I think that, we can create enclaves. We can vote people into positions of local power that act as some kind of a firewall against corporate abuse. But even if you vote people into local power, let's say, for instance, in a town in upstate New York, are you going to be able to stop these companies from fracking on your land? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we have to be realistic. We can't talk about hope until we grasp the reality, because otherwise, if we don't grasp the reality, then everything we do is futile, because it is essentially appealing to a system that can't be appealed to. It is disheartening. But once we understand the paradigm of power, then we can begin to make decisions that can muck up that power system.
We can fight for something that is viable, that's real. The Democratic and Republican parties sure aren't going to do it. Did I say Democratic and Republican parties? Perhaps I should have just said the Republicrats, because that's what they are. We need to bring about parties, political parties today, that serve the interests of the people as opposed to pimping the people. The people are getting pimped, be they black, be they white, be they brown, be they red, be they yellow. The people in this country and around the world being pimped. The only people who are going to stop the pimp are the people themselves. If you don't have, it's like a hamster in a cage that just constantly runs on that wheel. And so you remember, you run that wheel. I used to have a hamster when I was a kid. I used to watch that. That hamster was running and running and running. But it never went anywhere. Never got anywhere. We've got to stop being a hamster on that wheel. We have to stop salivating like Pavlov's dogs. Jumping back to, is voting even real? You know, my feelings, I'm ambivalent on that point. I believe we have to have systemic change. I go back and I quote the words of Albert Camus again when he said, what better way to enslave a man than to give him a vote and tell him he's free? We need to be creative of our own. I think that's up to us as a people as to what we're going to do or what we're not going to do. I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. And I was hopeful before Barack Obama was even born. And you translate that hope into action.
Yes, a lot of good people mobilized for Obama. But what did they demand of him? Working to elect a Democratic presidential candidate may seem like activism, but it isn't. Activism doesn't give up. Activism doesn't fall silent. One of my favorite quotations is from Milan Kundera. The struggle of people against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. We should never forget that the primary goal of great power is to distract and limit our natural desire for social justice and equity and real democracy. And that brings us back here to the United States, because I believe something is stirring in this country. Look at the polls. More than 2/3 of Americans say the government should care for those who cannot care for themselves. 64% would pay higher taxes to guarantee health care for everyone. 60% are favourable towards unions. 70% want nuclear disarmament. 72% want the US completely out of Iraq, and so on and so on. Ordinary Americans for too long have been misrepresented by stereotypes that are contemptuous. The progressive attitudes of the public are seldom reported in the media because they're not ignorant, they're subversive. They are ordinary people who belong to no elite and who judge their government in moral terms, though they would call it common decency. They are not vain, they are the people with a wakeful conscience, the best of American citizens. Sure, they disappear from view now and then, but they are like seeds beneath the snow. The American populace were far from perfect, but they often spoke for ordinary people, and they were betrayed by leaders who urged them to compromise and merge with the Democratic Party. That was long ago, but how familiar it sounds. My guess is that something is coming again. The signs are there. Noam Chomsky is right when he says that mere sparks can ignite a popular movement that may seem dormant. No one predicted 1968. No one predicted the fall of apartheid, or the Berlin Wall, or the Civil Rights Movement, or the great Latino rising of a few years ago. What Obama and the bankers and the generals and the IMF and the CIA and CNN and BBC fear is ordinary people coming together and acting together. It's a fear as old as democracy, a fear that suddenly people convert their anger to action, as they've done so often throughout history.
Hope will only come now when we physically defy the violence of the state. All who resist, all who are here today, keep hope alive. All who succumb to fear, despair, and apathy become an enemy of hope. They become, in their passivity, agents of injustice. If the enemies of hope are finally victorious in this nation, the poison of violence will become not only the language of power, but the language of opposition. And those who resist here today with nonviolence are the last thin line of defense between a civil society and its disintegration. Hope has a cost. Hope is not comfortable or easy. Hope requires personal risk. It is not about the right attitude or peace of mind. Hope is action. Hope is doing something. The more futile, the more useless, the more irrelevant and incomprehensible an act of rebellion is, the vaster and more potent hope becomes. Hope knows that an injustice visited on our neighbor is an injustice visited on all of us. Hope posits that people are drawn to the good by the good. This is the secret of hope's power. Hope demands for others what we demand for ourselves. Hope does not separate us from them. Hope sees in our enemy our own face. Hope is not for the practical and the sophisticated, the cynics and the complacent, the defeated and the fearful. Hope is what the corporate state, which saturates our airwaves with lies, seeks to obliterate. Hope is what this corporate state is determined to crush. Be afraid, they tell us. Surrender your liberties to us so we can make the world safe from terror. Don't resist. Embrace the alienation of our cheerful conformity. Buy our products. Without them, you are worthless. Become our brands. Do not look up from your electronic hallucinations, no. Above all, do not think. Obey. The powerful do not understand hope. Hope is not part of their vocabulary. They speak in the cold, dead words of national security, global markets, electoral strategy, staying on message, image, and money. The powerful protect their own. They divide the world into the damned and the blessed, the patriots and the enemy, the privileged and the weak. They insist that extinguishing lives in foreign wars or in our prison complexes is a form of human progress. They cannot see that the suffering of a child in Kandahar or a child in the blighted urban pocket of our nation's capital diminishes and impoverishes us all. They are deaf, dumb, and blind to hope. Those addicted to power, enthralled by self-exaltation, cannot decipher the words of hope any more than most of us can decipher hieroglyphics. Hope to Wall Street bankers and politicians, to the masters of war and commerce, is not practical. It is gibberish. It means nothing. And this is because they kneel before the idols of greed and money. If we resist and carry out acts, no matter how small, of open defiance, hope will not be extinguished. If all we accomplish today is to assure a grieving mother in Baghdad or Afghanistan, a young man or woman crippled physically and emotionally by the hammer blows of war, that he or she is not alone, our act will be successful. But hope cannot be sustained if it cannot be seen. Any act of rebellion, any physical defiance of those who make war, of those who perpetuate corporate greed and are responsible for state crimes, anything that seeks to draw the good to the good, nourishes our souls, and holds out the possibility that we can touch and transform the souls of others. Hope affirms that which we must affirm. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out. Wherever the just exchange their messages, may I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame.
A docker, I was a railwayman between the wars. I raised a family in time of austerity with sweat at the foundry between the wars. I paid the union and as times got harder, I looked to the government to help the working man, but they brought prosperity down at the armory. We're arming for peace, me boys, between the wars. I kept the faith and I kept voting, not for the iron fist but for the helping hand, for theirs is a land with a wall around it, and mine is a faith in my fellow man. Theirs is a land of hope and glory, mine is the green field and the factory floor. Theirs are the skies all dark with bombers, and mine is the peace we knew between the wars. Call up the craftsman, bring me the draftsman, build me a path from cradle to grave, and I'll give my consent to any government that does not deny a man a living wage. Go find the young men, never to fight again, bring up the banners from the days gone by. Sweet moderation, heart of this nation, desert us not, we are between the wars.